This is the M1 Max. It's the fastest laptop Apple makes right now. And then here's the original M1 MacBook Pro, the slowest M1 laptop Apple makes. Today, I'll be comparing these Macs specifically for video editing. All comparisons will be real-world tests with not a single benchmark. I'll be doing playback, scrubbing, and render tests using multiple video codecs and frame rates, export tests, tests with simple timelines, as well as complicated timelines loaded with tons of effects, then finishing off with stabilization, color grade, and transcode tests. How much more video editing performance do you think the most expensive M1 Max will get versus the original M1 MacBook Pro? Before we begin, here are the full specs for each Mac. The only upgrade on the M1 MacBook is double the SSD storage, so you can actually get it for $1,300 US instead of $1,500. The M1 Max is about 2.7 times more expensive, coming in at $3,500. First test is playback quality in a 4K timeline with 4K footage. Both the M1 Max and the M1 have no issue playing back this H.265 video in 24 frames per second, 60, and 120 frames per second with 0 drop frames. Next codec is H.264, which is less compressed. Both Macs can again play all 3 frame rates without any issues. And the last codec, which is the least compressed all-intra, all frame rates once again play smoothly. Next test is scrubbing performance. H.265 at 24 frames per second scrubs slightly better on the M1 Max. 60 FPS definitely looks better on the M1 Max. And for 120 frames per second, there's no doubt the M1 Max is better. H.264 is basically the same as H.265, with the M1 Max scrubbing better than the M1 in 24, 60, and especially 120 frames per second. All intra plays completely buttery smooth for both the M1 Max and the M1 with no drop frames. Test number 3 is working in a real project that's loaded with tons of effects. The A-roll is an easier to process codec, H.265 420, 4K, 24 frames per second, and 50 megabits per second. First test in this project is simply rendering the A-roll timeline with all native and third-party effects disabled. This project is 18 minutes and 50 seconds long. The M1 MAX MacBook Pro is able to complete the render on a 4K timeline in 2 minutes and 42 seconds, or 2.7 minutes. And the M1 was significantly slower at 6.05 minutes. On a 1080 timeline, the same A-roll render was 1.32 minutes on the M1 Max and 2.83 minutes on the M1. This test is the big one, render and export of the entire project with all effects enabled. The M1 Max completed the render with a 4K timeline in 21.82 minutes, and the M1 was 33.38 minutes. Exporting the rendered project took the M1 Max 52.85 minutes, and unfortunately the M1 crashed when it got to 81%, but estimating the last few percent, I'd say the fastest it could have finished would be about 1 hour, 20 minutes, and 26 seconds. But truthfully, it could have even been longer. Switching to a 1080 timeline, things were quite a bit faster, especially for the M1. The M1 Max completed the render for the full project in 13.02 minutes, and this time the M1 wasn't too far behind at 16.3 minutes. The M1 Max exported the entire project in 29.15 minutes, and again the M1 wasn't too far behind at 35.7 minutes. Knowing how fast a Mac can render and export is good, but I also wanted to test how well the M1 Max and the M1 can handle playback in this massive project when nothing is rendered. This is still a 4K timeline with better quality playback on, and going from a 6 to a 10 effect stack. Starting from 1:16:10, the M1 Max plays until 1:22:01 before it drops frames, while the M1 can barely even play for a second before it drops at 1:17:13. Switching the timeline to better performance though, both Macs can play through the entire effect stack without dropping any frames. Better performance mode reduces the image quality of the source video to 25%. The next effect stack is even bigger, going from 1 effect up to 17 in quality playback. Starting at 10:51:10, the M1 Max drops frames at 11:01:21, while the M1 once again struggles, dropping right away at 10:52:23. Switching to performance playback again, the M1 Max plays through, and surprisingly the M1 can also play through without dropping frames. As I mentioned, those tests were in an unrendered timeline, so I let both Macs render each section, and in a 4K timeline with quality playback, both the M1 Max and the M1 could get through the stacks in the first and second examples with no problems. I switched the timeline to 1080 to also see if this would boost performance, since the original M1 seems to fare a little bit better. The M1 Max played for half a second longer for the first example and stopped at 1:22:13, and also for a half a second longer in the second example, dropping frames at 11:02:07. As expected, the M1 did a bit better, playing for 5 seconds longer in the first example to 1:21:06, and just over 3 seconds longer in the second example to 10:56:01. The final test I wanted to do in this complicated project is the time it takes to render just one effect in the 17 stack. I know when I want to do something simple like change the duration of an effect, it's a pain when it takes forever to render that one change. The way this test works is I render the entire 17 stack, then I extend just one effect by 1420 seconds, and I start the timer when I re-render the effect stack. In a 4K timeline, the M1 Max took 4.62 minutes, while the M1 was 5.67 minutes. Reducing to a more reasonable 7 stack, the M1 Max took 3.58 minutes to render, and the M1 was 4.25 minutes. The M1 Max really isn't that impressive in this case, but I did notice something when I was testing the M1 Max against the base M1 MacBook Pro in a different video. Both of them would get quite different results for the same test even though I didn't change anything, and the M1 Pro actually beat out the M1 Max. Based off of some of the results that I later found, I think the M1 Max could have actually finished the 4K 17 stack render closer to 2.02 minutes and the 7 stack in around 1.48 minutes. For the 1080 versions of the renders, the M1 Max was much faster, with the 17 stack being completed in 1.78 minutes, and the M1 was 3.83 minutes. The 1080 stack render was 1.23 minutes on the M1 Max and 2.85 minutes on the M1. Next test is going back to those codec and frame rate shots, this time with some render and export tests. For the 24 frames per second, 5-minute talking head clips, I applied 120x magnification, as without it there would be nothing to render. All these tests will be in a 4K timeline. I would first test the export of the unrendered 24 frames per second clip, then time the rendering, and finally time exporting the project again once it had been rendered. For the 1 minute, 60, and 120 frames per second clips, I would slow down the footage to 40 and 20% respectively, and time how long it took to render that slow motion. Then once again time the export. Here are all the results for the codecs and frame rates. You can see that the M1 was actually able to keep up pretty decently with the M1 Max, not being too far behind in the unrendered export for 24 FPS. The M1 Max was about 2 times faster rendering the 120x magnification, and then there was basically no improvement for both Macs when exporting the rendered clip. Rendering 40% slow motion was once again twice as fast on the M1 Max, but the M1 kept up with the exporting. 120 frames per second behaved quite similarly as 60, as well as did the other codecs, with renders being about twice as fast on the M1 Max, and the M1 exporting only a bit slower than the M1 Max. I wanted to do just one test in a 1080 timeline to see how much faster things were compared to a 4K timeline. I used the H.265 24fps 5-minute talking head clip, and I did the same round of tests. The M1 Max completed the unrendered export in 1.57 minutes, while the M1 was only seconds behind at 1.8 minutes. Rendering the 120x magnification was 33 seconds for the M1 Max, 51 seconds on the M1. And lastly, exporting the render timeline was 1.55 minutes on the M1 Max, and the M1 was 1.63 minutes. Seems like in a 1080 project, the M1 is a real contender for the M1 Max. Moving on to stabilization using the same 1 minute, 60, and 120 frames per second clips. For these tests, I turned off auto render, so as soon as the stabilization transcode was complete, it would start rendering the stabilization immediately. I kept the clips at full speed though, so there's no rendering power being used for slow motion. For H.265 60fps, the M1 Max took 1.2 minutes to stabilize, and the M1 was 1.98 minutes. For the 120fps clip, the M1 Max was 2 minutes, and the M1 was 3.78 minutes. The stabilization and renders were very similar for the other codecs. The M1 Max was always faster, but the M1 was especially slow for 120 frames per second. Next test is another effects test to see how many I can stack before we drop frames, but in a much more controlled scenario. This one will have effects starting at evenly spaced intervals to see how big the stack can go. I used this simple line animation from a third-party plugin that I stacked every 0.5 seconds. For a 4K unrendered timeline and quality playback, the M1 Max could handle 20 lines before it dropped frames, while the M1 could only do 16. Changing to performance playback, the M1 Max could play the entire 60-line stack without dropping any frames, and the M1 also did much better, getting up to 52 lines. Changing the timeline to 1080 and quality playback, the M1 Max improved quite a bit and got to 58 lines, and the M1 also did much better, getting to 46 lines. Lastly, for a 1080 project and performance playback, the M1 Max and the M1 could play the whole 60-line stack. Next test is another full project, but this time it's much simpler with mainly native text effects and much smaller stacks. The A-roll is the same easy codec as before, H.265, but now it's double the bitrate at 100 megabits per second. Rendering just the 4K timeline, which is 9.28 minutes, with no effects active took the M1 Max 1.32 minutes, and the M1 2.68 minutes. Rendering the entire project with all effects active took the M1 Max 1.93 minutes and the M1 4 minutes. You can see how much faster things can render out with minimal native effects versus the extremely large effect stacks plus third-party plugins that I was testing earlier. Finally, exporting the full project took the M1 Max quite a bit longer than the renders at 10.47 minutes, and the M1 was also slower at 11.5 minutes. I repeated the tests on a 1080 timeline, and here are the results. The M1 Max is naturally faster than the M1 in the A-roll and full project renders, but really not much faster than the M1 for the export, as it was only 16 seconds slower than the M1 Max. Seriously, if you work exclusively in a 1080 timeline, the M1 might be all you need because it's barely slower than the M1 Max in all the 1080 tests so far. On to our second last test, color grading. I took the 5-minute H.265 clip from earlier and I stacked 15 adjustment layers with Final Cut Pro native color adjustments. The M1 Max can easily take on the entire stack, no problem. And while the M1 gets to the top of the effect stairs, it starts to get sluggish and after a few seconds ends up dropping frames. Realistically, it looks like both Macs will be able to handle any regular color adjustments. The second half of the color grade test is rendering the entire 5-minute clip with less intense color adjustment, but still pushing the global, shadows, highlights, and midtones, as well as the temperature and hue, and adding some adjustments in color finale as well as a LUT. The M1 Max finishes the render in a solid 1.62 minutes, and the M1 is quite a bit slower at 5.47 minutes. Last and final test, transcoding to optimize and proxy media. Once again, I did this for the various codecs and frame rates from earlier. I wanted to see how long it took to transcode all 3 frame rates for each codec. For H.265, transcoding 24, 60, and 120 frames per second to optimize took the M1 Max 1.28 minutes, beating the M1 substantially, with the M1 taking 6.2 minutes. Transcoding to proxy 50% took the M1 Max 42 seconds, and the M1 was 3.13 minutes. As you can see for H.264 and the all-intra codec, the Max performed the same, with the M1 Max of course beating the M1 in all the tests. However, the M1 was once again particularly slow for transcoding optimized in all codecs. These results are interesting, but given that the clips are shorter, I think the M1 is getting burst performance, and I suspect things will slow down for the M1 under longer sustained loads. To test this, I transcoded a project that consists of 13 minutes of footage over 56 clips, mostly in 120 frames per second with some in 60. All shot in H.265, 4K, and the highest bitrate possible being 150 and 200 megabits per second. Once again, the M1 Max takes a decisive win, transcoding the project to optimize in 5.47 minutes and proxy in 3.05 minutes. The M1 lagged majorly behind, transcoding optimized in 28.23 minutes and proxy in 14.6 minutes. And finally, for the very last test, I transcoded a talking head clip that's just like this. The clip is H.265 and 35 minutes long. The M1 Max transcoded optimized in 3.1 minutes and proxy in 1.82 minutes. The M1 had similar results to before, completing optimized in 16.72 minutes and proxy in 8.83 minutes. So were the results as you expected? Was the M1 Max 2.7 times more powerful than the M1 if correlating performance to cost? In some tests, definitely, and even more than 2.7 times faster. But for other tests, especially in 1080 timelines, the M1 did a seriously good job keeping up. If you're interested in seeing how the M1 Max did against the base M1 Pro MacBook Pro, check this video out. And I also compared a fully spec'd out 2020 Intel iMac, so check out to see how the new generation of M1 chips stacks against the last and fastest Intel iMac. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you within a few hours. Thank you very much for watching and I hope you have a fantastic day.